A ward sealed tight, yet murder slips inside. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Comment your city. I love hearing them. Let's open Wolfe's case in the locked ICU. You wouldn't think an intensive care unit could follow you home, but that's exactly what happened one Wednesday afternoon when the bell rang and Wolfe's sanctum was violated. I call it sanctum because to Wolfe, the brownstone on West 35th Street is about as sacred as a cathedral is to a bishop, which makes me the usher and general factotum, though with more jokes and less incense. I was at my desk, running through a stack of correspondence that had accumulated since Wolfe's last refusal to acknowledge anything involving money, danger, or inconvenience. Wolfe, in his chair, had his eyes closed, which meant he was either dozing or conducting some mental campaign against the idea of exertion. Fritz was in the kitchen, producing smells that belonged in an orchestra pit, tuning up for the evening's performance. The bell rang, sharp enough to wake the dead, or at least Wolfe. He opened one eye. "Archie," he said. That was enough. I went and opened the door. Standing there was a woman who had the air of someone used to giving orders and getting them obeyed. Square shoulders, eyes like she measured every angle, and a portfolio clutched against her chest as if it contained blueprints for a new Manhattan. She wasn't a nurse, but I pegged her for something medical the way you'd peg a man with a violin case as not being an accordion player. "I need to see Mr. Wolfe," she said. No preamble, no charm. Well, aren't we lucky? That's exactly who lives here. "Come in." I brought her into the office and announced her with my usual flair. "Doctor in the house, boss." She introduced herself as Dr. Lenora Pike, Chief of Medicine at Gotham General. She didn't sit until Wolfe waved her to the red leather chair. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He gave her the sort of look he reserves for strangers who threaten to rearrange his schedule, which is to say, every stranger. "Madame, you're intruding," Wolfe said, his voice carrying that polite irritation that doubles as a stop sign. "This is neither a clinic nor a consultation room." She nodded briskly. "I'm aware. I wouldn't be here unless it were a matter of personal gravity. One of our secured patient files was tampered with. In the ICU, no one is supposed to have access. And yet, someone did." I glanced at Wolfe. Normally, anything involving hospitals would send him into a sulk. He dislikes illness, injury, and anything that suggests human fragility, unless it's culinary. But instead of shutting her down, he just closed his eyes again, as if savoring the taste of her words. "Tampered with?" he asked, barely moving his lips. "Yes, notes altered. Signatures forged. We discovered it yesterday, but the implications are significant. Lives, reputations, careers, everything could unravel if this isn't handled discreetly. Now, if you're asking why a chief doctor would come to a man who hasn't seen the inside of a subway car in decades, the answer was in her eyes. She didn't trust her colleagues, the hospital board, or the police. Which left Wolfe, an overweight genius who hates leaving home, as her last, best bet. "You'll take the case," she said flatly. Wolfe opened both eyes. "Phooey, I haven't agreed to anything." But I saw something shift in his expression, subtle as a twitch in a marble statue, which meant he was already interested. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how a locked intensive care unit walked straight into our brownstone and put its feet on the ottoman. Fritz brought in the beer because Wolfe crooked a finger, which at our address is as good as a subpoena. Dr. Pike declined a glass, which told me something about her ability to tolerate comfort. She sat rigid, portfolio on her knees like a life raft, and watched Wolfe as if he were an obstinate machine she intended to outstare into operation. "You say tampered," Wolfe repeated after a swallow. "What did the interloper gain?" "Leverage," she said. "Political and personal. The file belongs to a patient in our locked unit, code name Hawthorne on internal notes. Real identity is shielded at the board's request. Someone altered orders on day 3. Subtle changes to a sedation schedule and a trial medication notation. Not enough to kill. Enough to redirect authority. If the chart stands, it appears I approved an investigational therapy I explicitly refused. That implicates me, protects someone else, and hands the board a reason to suspend me while they review. The board, Wolfe murmured. His eyelids sank halfway. There are people who take that for drowsy. It is contemplation served with sauce. Why conceal the identity from you? They didn't, she said, from the staff. I know who the patient is, a philanthropist, Lionel Keever. That got a low whistle out of me. I didn't mean to let loose. Keever's name wanders through more buildings than a janitor's key ring. He'd once sniffed around Wolfe's orchids and sent a case of Tokaji as a thank you for a tour he didn't get. Wolfe had returned it, which had irritated our liquor shelf, and no one else. Mr. Keever was admitted under pressure, Pike went on. Not his blood pressure. A stroke, minor, stable. But he's also a silent investor in a biotech arm angling to push their compound into our protocols. I refused. Then, in the ICU chart, a note appears. Trial candidate, prelim consent documented, Pike to countersign. My signature was forged. Sloppy? I asked. Good enough to pass a quick glance, she said. Not mine, but it might carry the day if the board wants it to. We caught it only because a nurse, one of the best, flagged an inconsistency. The consent was referenced, but the form wasn't in the binder. She raised the alarm. At morning rounds, the consent had magically appeared. Perfectly filed, perfectly backdated, perfectly wrong. Wolfe set his glass down on the lemon wood, which twitched my fingers, but he was precise. Your nurse's name? Maris Yeo. Experienced, clean record, no politics. I don't believe in people without politics, Wolfe said. They are like soups without salt. They exist only as a rebuke. Pike didn't smile. Mr. Wolfe, I came to you because our house is divided, and I can't ask the police to conduct a discreet handwriting seminar in my ICU. The board will weaponize any whiff of scandal. Someone is forcing my hand. I need you to find who, and quickly. Quickly, Wolfe repeated with distaste. Hurry is a form of rudeness, but the matter is tempting. He turned his head to me. Archie. Present, I said. Note. We require facsimiles of the alleged consent and the forged countersignature, the nursing logs for days 2 through 4, the badge access records for the ICU during the same period, and the list of all personnel with edit privileges for electronic notes. Pike tightened her grip on the portfolio. I anticipated that. She unclasped it and laid out a series of sealed envelopes, each labeled in block print. She started to place them on Wolfe's desk. On the table to your left, please, Wolfe said, not loudly. She looked at him, then at the desk, and changed course. Outsiders who treat his desk like a loading dock receive the sort of look usually given to fruit flies. I'll also give you a list, she said, arranging the packages on the side table like surgical instruments. People with motives, if you insist, the board liaison, a compliance officer who quotes policy like scripture, the biotech's medical director, and a family representative who says they speak for Keever, though I've never seen him grant anyone that right. Wolfe's eyelids rose a fraction. Names. Harold Sen, board liaison, Ethan Vale, compliance, Dr. Jada Bell, biotech, and Lyle Keever, the nephew. The nephew, Wolfe said as if it were a genus. Bring them here. She blinked. All of them? My legs are not ambulatory, Wolfe said, and my patience is not inexhaustible. If you want discretion, you will supply me with the raw material in an environment I control. Tonight would be preferable, but not mandatory. You expect them to come on your word. On yours, he said. She exhaled, a tight, professional release that didn't waste energy on drama. All right. I can arrange tomorrow evening. Gotham General is not a jail, and these people like to be seen accommodating. But I'm warning you, if you mishandle this, I lose my job, and that ICU loses the chief who won't turn it into a billboard. That, Wolfe said, is the only persuasive statement you have made. I escorted her to the door. On the threshold she paused. Mr. Goodwin, a personal request. If you find any indication that my nurse was pressured, off the record, tell me first. I told her I was an enthusiastic advocate of telling people first, especially if they paid for it, and closed the door behind her. When I returned, Wolfe had swiveled the smallest degree his bulk allows and was looking at the sealed packets as if they might sprout. You're hooked, I said. Do I tell Saul to oil his shoes? Not yet. We do not possess a fish. We have a ripple. He tapped the arm of his chair. A philanthropist's locked room, not of walls, but of permissions. Someone wants authority manufactured and guilt reassigned. That suggests a triangle. The board, the biotech, and blood. We will know which apex is weight-bearing when we know who had the nerve to insert the form and the wit to backdate the log. He closed his eyes again. Call Miss Yo. I don't have her number. In the second envelope, Archie. Top sheaf, third page. It was, of course. I rang the hospital and asked for her, using a tone that gets me transferred instead of put on hold. When she came on, her voice had the clipped steadiness of someone who has trained panic to sit in the corner. This is Archie Goodwin, I said. I work for Nero Wolfe. Dr. Pike wants you to help us keep our dance card clear. A pause then. I'll help, but I won't lie. Lucky you, neither will he. I set a time for her to stop by that evening, and when I hung up, Wolfe's eyes were still closed. You didn't take a retainer, I said. He sniffed. I took possession. Money will arrive with the first concession to reason. Which is? That they will come, he said. And they will think the brownstone is a room they can walk through. It is not. It wasn't. But as the doorbell rang again, and I went to intercept what the tide had decided to slosh in next, I had to admit it was starting to feel like a hallway. It wasn't Saul or a nurse or anyone from Gotham General. The second ring turned out to be a delivery kid with a package for Wolfe. Books, of course, ordered weeks ago because Wolfe doesn't trust publishers to remember his existence without prompting. I signed, tipped, and sent him on his way. But by the time I got back to the office, Wolfe had already opened one eye in my direction. That interruption, he said, was gratuitous. Do not indulge it again. Yes, sir, I told him. Next time I'll intercept the UPS fleet 3 blocks over. We'll build a moat. His only answer was to close the eye again, which is Wolfen for shut up. So I did, until the doorbell went off a third time. Wolfe's sigh was a low rumble, like distant thunder. This time, it was different. When I opened the door, the woman waiting on the stoop was petite, dark-haired, and wore a nurse's uniform with the starch level turned up to parade ground. Her eyes moved quickly, cataloguing the hall behind me as if expecting it to sprout hospital equipment. Miss Yo? I asked. Yes. Dr. Pike told me Mr. Wolfe wanted to see me this evening. She said it calmly, but her hands were tight on her bag straps, and I had the feeling she hadn't come here without a solid internal argument first. I brought her inside, ushered her into the office, and introduced her to Wolfe. She sat where Pike had, but unlike the doctor, she perched forward as if ready to bolt. Wolfe greeted her with his customary courtesy, which is to say, he gave her a curt nod and gestured for her to speak. She did. I noticed the inconsistency because I know my rounds. When I checked Mr. Keever's file Tuesday morning, the consent wasn't there. By Wednesday it was, along with a forged reference in the night notes. I checked badge access. 3 people had logged in after midnight, none of whom should have been on that wing. I flagged it to Dr. Pike. 3 people. Wolfe repeated. Names. Her eyes flickered. They'll know I talked. Names, Wolfe said again softly. Vale, the compliance officer, Bell from biotech, and Lyle Keever. That last one landed in the air like a brick in a fish tank. I saw Wolfe's lips pressed together. He didn't speak, which is his trick when he wants the silence to do the work. Miss Yeo leaned forward. I've worked there 10 years. I've never seen anything like this. If Mr. Keever recovers and finds out his own nephew altered his care without permission. She stopped, caught herself, and glanced at me. I shouldn't be saying more. Yet you are here, Wolfe said. That is telling. You know your exposure. You also know your duty. You have my assurance that I will not let the matter become a cudgel for the board or a lever against you. Archie, record her statement. I jotted it down. Wolfe doesn't dictate unnecessarily, but when he does, you know he intends to use it. When she left, after a glass of water Fritz insisted on pressing into her hand, I closed the door behind her and leaned against it. 3 names, I said. Which one do you want first? All, Wolfe said. But not by your legs. By their legs. Dr. Pike will summon them. Until then, we proceed by inference. He turned his head toward me. You will, however, verify the nephew's whereabouts during that midnight visit. And how do you propose I ask him that? Say, Lyle, did you go joyriding through your uncle's ICU file last Tuesday night? Improvise, Wolfe said, and picked up the first of Pike's sealed packets. His eyes scanned the pages, slow and meticulous, while I started considering which shoes to wear for a jaunt to Gotham General. That's how it always begins. Wolfe sends out the thought, I'm left to do the walking. And as I headed for the door a half-hour later, he called after me with one more line, one that set the tone of the whole job. Archie, this is not about medicine. It is about ownership. Remember that. I remembered. Especially when, 2 hours later, I was standing in the sterile hallway of the ICU, watching Lyle Keever argue with a nurse half his size and twice his intelligence, and realized Wolfe hadn't just hooked a ripple, he'd snagged himself a current. The thing about hospitals is, they never close and they never stop humming. Gotham General at 9 in the evening was no exception. The ICU corridor was washed in antiseptic light, with that low electrical buzz in the walls that makes you wonder if the patients are sleeping or just being lulled by current. At the end of the hall stood Lyle Keever, mid-30s, slick hair, tie knotted with more confidence than sense. He was wagging a finger at a nurse who looked unimpressed enough to file it under uncooperative visitor. You can't restrict family, he was saying. You're not even his direct caregiver. I'll have this reported. The nurse crossed her arms. Visitation after hours is limited to 2 relatives at a time. That's hospital policy. That's when I decided to stroll over. There's a certain advantage to arriving as though you belong, even when you don't. Mr. Keever, I asked, pitching it like I had every right in the world to interrupt. He turned, gave me a quick once-over, and settled on disdain. Do I know you? No, but you should. I'm Archie Goodwin. I work with Nero Wolfe. The nurse looked relieved to have someone else intercept the storm, and she faded back toward the station. Lyle straightened his tie as if to reclaim the authority he thought he'd lost. Wolfe? He said. Why would he be interested in my uncle? I gave him the kind of smile that makes people lean forward to find out what they're missing. Because your uncle's medical chart seems to have developed a life of its own, and somebody with your badge wandered through the ICU files in the middle of the night. That jolted him. Not much, a twitch around the mouth, a quick flare in the eyes, but enough. He tried to cover it with a laugh. You've been listening to gossip. My uncle's care is my responsibility. He asked me to ensure his interests are protected. If that means checking records, then I will. Interesting, I said, because according to Dr. Pike, your uncle is in no shape to ask anybody for anything, least of all a signature. He bristled. Pike is trying to undermine me. She's been against the trial therapy from the start. She thinks she knows what's best for my uncle, but she doesn't know him like I do. Or his money, I said. That earned me a sharp glare. Careful, Mr. Goodwin. You may think you can poke fun, but my uncle trusts me. When he recovers, he'll remember who was in his corner. I shrugged, because nothing gets under a man's skin faster than indifference. If you say so. But here's the thing. The board will want to know who touched that chart, and Wolfe intends to find out. When he calls you in tomorrow, you'd be wise to bring more than bluster. He doesn't care for it. I left him standing there, simmering, and took a slow walk back down the hall. On my way out, I passed a glass panel where Lionel Keever himself lay behind tubes and monitors. The old man looked small under the blankets, his face slack but not vacant, as though holding on to some thread of private defiance. I wondered how much he understood of the battle outside his room. Enough, maybe, to know he was being used as a bargaining chip. Outside, the night air cut cleaner than the hospital's recycled oxygen. I flagged a cab and rode back to the brownstone, rehearsing the lines I'd feed Wolfe. He doesn't like padding, just the meat, trimmed and arranged. When I came in, Wolfe was exactly where I'd left him, chair tilted back, lips compressed. The envelopes had been opened, their contents arrayed on the side table in neat piles. He looked up as I set my hat down. Well, your nephew's a beaut, I said. He admits he checked the records. Claims his uncle authorized it, which is a neat trick for a man on heavy sedation. He also claims Pike's been blocking a trial therapy, and that he's only looking out for Uncle Lionel's interests. If you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you. Good view of the East River. Wolfe grunted. Did he betray surprise when you mentioned his badge access? He twitched, then covered with bluster. Noted. Wolfe closed his eyes and his fingers began drumming on the chair arm. That's when I knew he was working. Tomorrow, when the assemblage arrives, I will begin with Mr. Vale. Compliance officers are incapable of brevity, which makes them useful. Their verbosity betrays them. And Lyle. He is already betraying himself, but I will not declare until the others have performed. Wolfe leaned back, steepling his hands. Archie, prepare the office. The chairs must be arranged with precision. I want them made to feel they are in a courtroom, not a salon. You're the judge, jury, and bailiff? The tribunal, he said. And tomorrow evening I shall convene it. I headed upstairs to bed later with that phrase sticking in my head. The tribunal. Wolfe hadn't said who the accused was yet, but he would. He always did. And when he did, I had the uneasy feeling someone's career, or maybe more, would bleed out right there on the rug of the brownstone. By the time morning rolled around, Wolfe had done what he always does when a case is about to crowd his schedule. He barricaded himself upstairs with his orchids, leaving me to manage the incoming tide. That's standard operating procedure. He spends the hours inhaling rare air and lecturing. Flowers while I field phone calls, line up meetings, and figure out who's going to try and wriggle out of showing up when Wolfe demands it. The first call came at 10 from Dr. Pike. She was clipped and efficient, which I suspected was her default setting, though I could hear fatigue layered under it. She confirmed that she'd spoken with Vale, Bell, and Sen, and that all three, plus Lyle, would come to the brownstone by 7 that evening. I told her we'd roll out the red carpet, though in truth it was more of a Persian rug and Wolfe's stare. She added that the board had already begun sniffing around the forged document, quietly, but enough to worry her. That only sharpened Wolfe's edge when I relayed it to him upstairs. Good, he said from the plant room, his voice muffled by glass and greenery. The more pressure, the more fissures. Archie, ensure the dining room is inaccessible. No one strays from the office. I made a note. Wolfe doesn't like suspects wandering near Fritz's domain, and Fritz likes it even less. Around midday, I got a chance to exercise my legs. I headed to Gotham General to test another angle. Ethan Vale, compliance officer. He wasn't scheduled to drop by Wolfe's office until evening, but I wanted a read on him first. His office was tucked away in a corner that could have doubled as a broom closet, complete with stale coffee smell. Vale was there, hunched over a laptop, wire-rimmed glasses perched low, hair combed like he'd done it with a ruler. "Mr. Goodwin," he said when I introduced myself, his tone suggesting he'd rehearsed the name. "I was expecting you later." "Call this a preview," I said. "You were in the ICU after hours last week." His hands froze on the keyboard. Then he leaned back, adjusting his glasses. "I review access routinely. Compliance requires it. If a chart was altered, my job is to trace the who, the when, and the why." "Convenient that you happen to be logged in during the night in question," I said. "I log in at odd hours. That is not evidence of misconduct. It's evidence of diligence." That was his line, and he delivered it with the smugness of a man who thinks he's bulletproof because he has a rulebook in his pocket. But he couldn't hide the slight sheen of sweat at his hairline. I pressed a little. "Then you'll have no problem explaining it to Wolfe tonight." He gave me a thin smile. "Explaining is my profession." That was all I needed. I left him to his keyboard and his coffee, satisfied that he'd tried to drown Wolfe in policy jargon. That kind of arrogance always plays right into Wolfe's hands. Back at the brownstone, Fritz was already preparing the evening meal, which meant the kitchen smelled like veal stock and thyme. Wolfe had reinstalled himself in the office, the envelopes and papers spread across his desk in a pattern only he understood. When I told him about Vale, his lips twitched. "Ah, pedant," he said. "They are useful. Their vanity blinds them to the fact that their prolixity betrays them. He will speak too much." "Yeah," I said, "and Lyle will bluster too much. That leaves Bell and Sen. What's their angle?" "Dr. Bell," Wolfe mused, "will defend the biotech's honor, but her presence in the ICU at midnight is anomalous. As for Mr. Sen, liaisons exist to ensure that neither side trusts the other. He will attempt diplomacy, and in doing so, reveal where his loyalties truly lie." He closed his eyes, steepled his fingers, and said nothing more. That was my cue to keep out of the way until the circus arrived. The hours until 7 stretched out like taut wire. I took calls, cleaned ashtrays, and rearranged chairs according to Wolfe's specifications, 2 rows facing his desk, with just enough space between them to remind the guests they were not here for tea. Fritz delivered snacks to me but drew a hard line at anyone else. The brownstone was preparing for trial, and Fritz was not about to let hors d'oeuvres cheapen it. At precisely 7, the bell rang, long and insistent. I opened the door to find all 4 of them arriving together, as if they'd conspired to show solidarity. Pike was with them, her jaw set. Vale carried a folder. Sen wore a diplomat's half-smile. Bell radiated indignation, and Lyle looked ready to sue the wallpaper. "Welcome to the tribunal," I said, stepping aside. They filed in, eyes flicking around the room as if the walls might take notes. Wolfe waited behind his desk, serene, immense, and immovable. He didn't stand. He never does. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice filling the room without effort, "you're here because of a forgery. Tonight we shall determine its parentage." And just like that, the brownstone became a courtroom. The air tightened. The rug might as well have been a witness stand, and Wolfe, without shifting an ounce of his weight, took control of the room. Wolfe let the silence work first. That was always his opening gambit. Say little, do less, and let the air tighten until someone filled it with words they shouldn't. The quartet of suspects shifted in their seats under his gaze. Pike sat ramrod straight, as if holding herself in by force. Sen leaned back, fingers laced across his stomach, projecting calm but not quite pulling it off. Bell perched on the edge, chin high, daring Wolfe to accuse her. Vale adjusted his glasses like a nervous tick, and Lyle crossed his arms in the universal sign for defiance. "You are here," Wolfe said, voice smooth as aged port, "because a document exists that should not. Its existence implicates one of you, or more. Its purpose is obvious, to convert Dr. Pike's refusal into assent. That is forgery, and forgery implies motive. He let the words hang, then flicked his eyes toward me. That was my cue. I laid the sealed envelope on his desk, slit open. Inside was the forged consent form. Wolfe touched it with one finger as though it were mildly distasteful but useful, like a lemon peel floating in good brandy. "Dr. Bell," he said. His tone was not a question, but it was also not permission to relax. "Your company seeks approval for its compound. Your presence in the ICU at midnight suggests eagerness. Explain." Bell's chin tilted higher. "My compound is a novel therapeutic with strong preliminary data. Mr. Keever represents both a candidate and a benefactor. I visited the ICU because his family representative requested a briefing. It is not unusual for me to be present." "Ah," Wolfe murmured. "So it was the nephew who summoned you?" Bell hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Mr. Lyle Keever asked me to provide context." Lyle shifted. "Of course I did. My uncle's health deserves every option. If Pike had her way, he'd rot under sedation instead of being offered a chance." "Your uncle is incapable of informed consent," Wolfe said flatly. "Yet a consent appeared, carrying Dr. Pike's forged signature. That is not chance. That is orchestration." Vale jumped in, perhaps too eagerly. "Which is why compliance exists, Mr. Wolfe, to prevent such irregularities. I did review the chart, yes, but I flagged the anomaly. Without oversight, this could have slipped through unnoticed." I watched his hands. They twitched against his folder, like he wanted to produce proof but wasn't sure it would help him. "Flagged," Wolfe repeated, his lip curling slightly. "And yet your login aligns precisely with the time the consent appeared. What did you flag, Mr. Vale? The forgery you had just entered?" That got a protest from Vale, fast and loud. "Absolutely not. I observed only what was there. If you're suggesting I planted it—" "Pfui," Wolfe cut him off, sharp enough to slice the air. "I'm not suggesting. I'm observing the pattern. 3 of you were present or proximate in time. Vale, Bell, Lyle, Mr. Sen." Wolfe turned his gaze. The liaison gave his diplomat's smile. "My role is facilitation. The board insists on transparency, and I provide it. I had no reason to alter anything. My authority does not extend to patient files." "No," Wolfe said softly. "But your authority extends to deciding which whispers reach the board's ears. A forged consent would, in time, arrive neatly framed as Pike's negligence. That would suit your masters admirably." Sen's smile stiffened. He didn't answer. The silence stretched again until Wolfe sighed. "Archie, I knew the drill. Each of you had reason to want Pike neutralized. Bell for approval, Vale for leverage, Sen for politics, Lyle for control over Uncle Lionel's empire. The forgery served every one of you, but only one had the audacity to slip it in and trust the others to protect it." "Which one?" Wolfe's eyes closed, and for a moment it looked like he was dozing. Then he opened them, dark and steady. "Not yet," he said. "We are not at revelation. We are at confession." He leaned forward the barest inch, which for Wolfe was a thunderclap. "Tonight you will try to lie. You will try to clothe yourself in policy, in science, in filial devotion. I will strip those garments one by one. Archie, note the tremor in Dr. Bell's voice, the sweat on Mr. Vale's temple, the rigidity in Mr. Sen's smile, the impatience in Mr. Keever's eyes. These are the fibers of guilt." The 4 of them bristled, each in their own way. Bell bit her lip. Vale shuffled papers. Sen adjusted his cuffs. Lyle's jaw clenched. Pike alone sat still, a surgeon observing. Wolfe let the tableau ripen. "We adjourn until tomorrow evening," he said finally. "Return then. By that time I will have the answer, and when you come, be prepared to hear it." I showed them out, one by one, watching the way they carried their unease down the steps. Vale muttered into his phone before the cab even pulled away. Belle stalked off briskly. Sen offered Pike a murmured aside that she didn't answer. Lyle didn't bother with pretense. He slammed the door of his car like it owed him money. When I came back inside, Wolfe had already leaned back with his eyes shut, breathing deep. "You let them off easy," I said. "No," he murmured. "I gave them rope. Tomorrow we will see who fashions the noose." And with that, he closed his eyes again, already dining on the silence while I tried to shake off the feeling that the brownstone itself was holding its breath. The brownstone was quieter than usual the next morning, which was saying something for a house that already resembled a monastery with better meals. Wolfe disappeared upstairs after breakfast, leaving Fritz and me to hold the fort. Fritz kept himself occupied with a duck that had been marinating overnight, while I tried to sort through the stack of notes and fragments Wolfe had left from the night before. He never writes in complete sentences, just little bursts of logic like breadcrumbs, expecting me to know the trail. At 11, Saul Panzer dropped by. Wolfe hadn't summoned him officially, which made his appearance a curiosity. Saul doesn't waste shoe leather without reason. He came into the office, took off his hat, and sat like the air itself didn't notice him. That's Saul's gift. He can melt into a crowd of two. "Morning, Archie," he said. "Wolfe upstairs?" "Consorting with orchids," I told him, which means I'm his answering service. "You got something?" He nodded. "You asked me last night to run a background check on the nephew." "I did." I hadn't asked, not directly. I'd only hinted. That's Saul for you. He catches hints like most people catch colds. "What's the verdict?" Saul pulled out a thin folder. "Debts, big ones. Not personal gambling, more like investments gone sour. He was trying to launch a boutique real estate firm. Uncle Lionel cut him off 3 months ago. Since then, he's been scrambling. If the old man recovers and keeps the purse strings tight, Lyle's sunk." That piece fit the puzzle snugly. I thanked Saul and slipped him his usual envelope, which he pocketed without looking. He left as quietly as he'd arrived, and I carried the news upstairs. Wolfe didn't even look up from the orchids when I reported. "As expected," he said. "A motive without imagination. The forgery requires cunning. Mr. Keever possesses appetite, but not subtlety." "Then you're leaning elsewhere," I said. "I lean nowhere. I observe." He wiped his hands, turned and fixed me with that heavy-lidded gaze. "Tonight we will not merely observe. We will induce. Arrange the room again, Archie, and ensure Miss Yeo attends. Her presence is a fulcrum." That meant more preparation. I called Pike and relayed the request, which she agreed to without hesitation. Then I rang Yeo, who sounded wary but willing. She promised to be at the brownstone by 7. The rest of the day passed like an orchestra tuning, low, restless, waiting for the baton. When evening came, the bell announced the ensemble. They filed in one at a time this time, not a united front. Bell came first, brisk and taut. Vale followed, clutching his folder like a shield. Sen drifted in with his politician's smile intact, and Lyle stormed through last, shoulders squared for a fight. Pike and Yeo arrived together, the doctor steady, the nurse pale but composed. The office was ready, chairs lined in 2 rows, Wolfe's desk set like a judge's bench. He sat massive and still, eyes half-lidded, as if they'd all gathered voluntarily for his amusement. "Tonight," he began, "we progress from conjecture to demonstration. Forgery, like all crimes, leaves residue, not on the paper, but on the human frame. Each of you has carried that residue into my house." He nodded at me, and I produced 2 enlarged copies of the consent form, pinned them to boards, and set them where all could see. "Observe," Wolfe said. "The signature is a simulacrum of Dr. Pike's hand, not incompetent, but not flawless. To imitate her, the forger required samples. Those samples exist only in one place, the credentialing files. Vale stiffened. His folder slipped an inch. Wolfe's gaze settled on him like a hawk's. You had access, Wolfe continued, and you had motive. By engineering Pike's downfall, you elevate your department's power, yet the forgery is too ambitious for you, Mr. Vale. Your caution would balk. Vale sputtered. Then why single me out? Silence, Wolfe snapped, and Vale sat back as though struck. Wolfe turned next to Bell. Dr. Bell, your eagerness betrays you. You stood to gain immediate approval if Pike's refusal were erased. You possess the intelligence to attempt such a forgery. Yet your signature style is too forceful, too assured. This forgery quivers with hesitation. Bell flushed but held her chin high. Sen, Wolfe went on, his tone almost bored. You cultivate neutrality, but neutrality is itself a mask. You had no need to forge. You need only to profit from another's work. You are accessory, not architect. Sen's smile flickered, but he kept silent. Finally, Wolfe looked at Lyle. You, sir, are reckless. You logged into the ICU. You summoned Bell. You shouted at nurses. But forgery is not your language. Your desperation is too loud for such quiet crime. Lyle leaned forward, fists clenched. Then who? The room tightened. Wolfe closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them, sharp as razors. Monsieur, he said softly, you found the forgery because you placed it. You alone could ensure its discovery at the precise time to damn Dr. Pike but not endanger Mr. Keever's life. You alone had both access and opportunity. The nurse gasped, color draining from her face. Pike turned, stunned. Wolfe lifted a hand. Not malice, monsieur. Coercion. Someone pressed you, threatened perhaps your position or family. You obeyed, but your conscience forced you to alert Pike. That duality is written on your every gesture. Tonight, you will tell us who held the leash. The room erupted. Bell with indignant protests, Vale with denials, Lyle with accusations. Wolfe sat back, unmovable, while Yeo clutched her bag and looked from face to face, her silence more explosive than any outburst. And I knew, watching her struggle to speak, that Wolfe had thrown his net exactly where he meant to, and someone in that room was about to thrash hard enough to show their hand. Yeo's knuckles had gone white against the strap of her bag, her mouth opening and closing like she was weighing two different kinds of ruin. The others pressed her silently, though in 4 different registers. Vale's thin, wheedling stare, Bell's taut, righteous glare, Sen's soft, diplomatic murmur of calm, and Lyle's barely restrained snarl. Pike sat rigid, neither urging nor protecting, which told me she was giving Yeo the room to hang herself or redeem herself. I didn't, Yeo began, her voice too thin, then stopped, swallowed, and tried again. It wasn't my idea. I was told to insert it, only to place it, not to sign it. I didn't know what it would mean until afterward. But they said if I didn't, my position would be reviewed. My record would be stained. Who? Wolfe's voice cut like a scalpel, flat and unyielding. Her eyes darted toward Vale, then flinched to Bell, then settled, almost reluctantly, on Sen. It was Mr. Sen, she whispered. He told me the board needed Pike documented as having approved, that it was already decided, and I only had to make it appear in the file. He said it would protect the hospital's reputation and that no harm would come of it. The room went dead still, as though someone had switched off the oxygen. Sen's smile, that diplomatic curve he had worn all evening, didn't falter, but it hardened, became a shell instead of a gesture. That's a lie, he said quietly. A fabrication from a frightened nurse, coached perhaps, or pressured. He looked toward Pike, who didn't move. I act only at the board's direction. If Miss Yeo inserted anything, it was under a misunderstanding. Phooey, Wolfe muttered, almost lazily. You betray yourself, sir. You call it a misunderstanding before we have even established the nature of her action. You anticipate it because you already know. Sen's fingers tightened together in his lap. Bell leaned forward, eyes sharp. If this is true, then it was never about science. It was about politics. My work has been dragged into a scheme of leverage. Vale tried to salvage ground. If Sen authorized this, then compliance was bypassed entirely. That is an egregious breach. Be still, Wolfe ordered. Your babble is insufferable. He shifted slightly in his chair, which for him was the equivalent of pounding a gavel. The forgery was crude but effective. Only someone who believed themselves shielded by authority would attempt so brazen an insertion. Mr. Sen, you invoked the board as cloak and cudgel. You assumed their hunger for power would absolve you, but you erred in one crucial respect. You underestimated conscience. Miss Yeo's pangs have undone you. Sen finally abandoned the smile. His lips pressed flat, his eyes narrowing. You imagine your parlor trick as evidence. I require no trick, Wolfe replied. I require only logic. You needed Pike compromised, Bell dependent, Vale neutralized, and Lyle pacified. By forging Pike's assent, you could present yourself as the steady hand guiding chaos. That is a bureaucrat's dream, power without fingerprints. I watched Sen's face, and for once the mask slipped. Not in anger, that would have been too easy. No, what showed was calculation, the recognition that he'd been cornered not by evidence he could deny, but by reasoning he couldn't. Pike finally spoke, her voice controlled but seething underneath. You threatened my nurse. You manipulated my ICU. You thought you could turn my own staff into weapons against me. Sen didn't answer her. His eyes had gone to Wolfe, cold and steady, as if gauging the immovable bulk of him. Then, with a faint shrug, he said, The board will never allow this to stain me. You understand politics poorly, Mr. Wolfe. Wolfe exhaled, long and slow. On the contrary, I understand it too well. You will leave my house now. Archie will ensure that Dr. Pike receives the transcript of tonight's confession. She will decide whether to deliver it to the board or the district attorney. My role is concluded. That was it. No dramatics, no handcuffs, no police bursting in. Wolfe's weapon is words, and he had fired the last round. I stood, opened the door, and ushered them out one by one. Vale sputtered protests about procedure. Bell stalked off fuming. Lyle muttered something about bringing his lawyers down like thunder, and Pike guided Yeo out with a protective hand on her shoulder. Sen was last. He paused on the threshold, gave Wolfe a final cool glance, and said, You mistake inevitability for guilt. Wolfe didn't bother replying. He just closed his eyes. When the door shut, the brownstone sighed back into itself, silence settling like dust after a storm. Fritz appeared with a tray, cheese, bread, and a bottle already uncorked. Wolfe opened his eyes, just long enough to nod approval, then let them close again. I poured a glass for him and sat with my own. So that's it. We just hand Pike the package and let her wrestle it out with the board? Yes, Wolfe murmured. Justice in bureaucracies is not delivered by police, but by exposure. The nurse spoke. The board will listen. Sen's armor is pierced. I leaned back, stretched my legs, and grinned. And here I thought you liked hospitals about as much as you like exercise. But you went and cured one of its infections. Pfui, Wolfe muttered, lifting his glass without opening his eyes. I cured nothing. I only diagnosed. And that, as always, was his final word on the matter. The house had almost settled when the phone rang again. I expected a telemarketer in search of our extended car warranty and was ready to extend something of my own, but it was Pike. Her voice was the same clipped instrument, only it had picked up a crack in the wood. The board moved the meeting to noon tomorrow, she said. Sen circulated a memo tonight. He claims my department is non-compliant under duress. He implies Miss Yeo recanted. He also implies your interview was coercive. That's rich, I said. He brought his own coercion as a party favor. Can Wolfe? Will he speak to them? Wolfe won't so much as stroll to the door, I told her. But he'll do better than speak. Hang tight till morning. I hung up and headed back to the office. Wolfe had his eyes closed, but he doesn't miss much through lids. I reported, and he made a low sound that in anyone else would have been a curse. Predictable, he said. A bureaucrat's counterstroke. Recast exposure as aggression. He opened his eyes. Archie, bring me the consent copy again. I set the board in front of him. He didn't touch the ink. He touched the paper. 2 fingers. Light, like reading Braille. Look, he said. Here. I looked. The top margin had a faint ripple, a shallow trough at the left corner, and the staple sat canted, pinching the paper in a way that left half-moon dents. It was the same in the backer copies from the packet Pike had provided, but those staples sat clean and square. Angle, Wolfe said. Miss Yeo staples true. She is habit and pride. This was inserted by someone who staples left-handed and carelessly. He closed his eyes. Vale is right-handed. Bell is right-handed. Sen, however, is left-handed. I didn't notice. You were looking at his smile, Wolfe said, not his pen. Tonight he folded his memo with his left hand over, not under, and he adjusted his cuffs with the same hand dominant. He could have ordered the forgery. He also could have signed it, depending on his vanity. That leaves motive squared, I said. But a signature isn't a board vote. No, Wolfe murmured. But a visible scandal disposes of Pike and opens a lane. Mr. Sen fancies himself a steward. He would steward the ICU until a compliant chief arrives. And Mr. Lyle would find the steward amenable to family considerations in a donor's care. Dr. Bell would be grateful. Mr. Vale would be quiet, if he were not already complicit. And if he wasn't, I said, he'd trumpet that from the roof. He will, Wolfe said. We shall give him a roof. We didn't sleep much. Fritz would have preferred we digest duck and peace. Instead, he lent us coffee. At 9 sharp, Wolfe called Pike and told her to bring the quartet back at 11. She said the board would riot. Wolfe said, let them. If they meet at noon, they will be nourished by 11. By 10:30, the brownstone was strung as tight as the night before. The bell rang at 11, 2 at a time. Bell and Vale arrived together, and for once Vale's folder wasn't a shield. It was ballast. Lyle came next, jaw set. Sen, punctual as doom, last with that courteous expression sanded down to Matt. Wolfe didn't waste silence this time. He gestured to Pike and Yeo, who'd settled in the back row. We will be brief, he said. Brevity suits the truth. He nodded to me. I put the consent board on the easel and a second board next to it. A blown-up photo of the staple bite, with a neat arc drawn to show where the metal had entered at the wrong pitch. Left-handed, Wolfe said. That by itself proves only carelessness. But carelessness married to privilege begets audacity. Sen gave a small snort, meant to read as amusement. Wolfe ignored it. Mr. Vale, you have told yourself that you kept to procedure. But you did not. You retrieved Pike's signature specimens from credentialing without logging the request. Wolfe lifted a sheaf. Miss Yeo's notes show she paged you when she found the chart wrong. Your call back took 14 minutes. In those 14 minutes, you logged into the ICU edit system, navigated to Keever's file, and added a cross-reference to a consent that did not exist. You did it to normalize its later appearance. Vale's face changed color by degrees. A bad sunrise. I flagged it, he said, voice thin, because it was there. You flagged what you planned to later disclaim, Wolfe said. But you did not staple it. You would not risk your hands with that. You left that to Mr. Sen, who believes his hands are always clean. Sen sat forward the fraction of an inch that his posture allowed. "You have no document tying me to a staple." "No," Wolfe said. "I have what you cannot bear. A chain. You summoned Dr. Bell at midnight to lend the scene legitimacy. You permitted the nephew to hover to later bleat family rights. You anointed compliance by letting Mr. Vale sniff at the edges, and then you told a nurse to insert what others had prepared. An assembly of alibis, each contradicting the next in small human ways. That is the chain, and chains rattle. Last night you rattled when Miss Yeo looked at you." Bell's eyes flashed. "I did not authorize or assist a forgery." "You authorized your presence," Wolfe said not unkindly. "To you it was advocacy. To Mr. Sen it was camouflage. He needed a physician in the room so the lie smelled medicinal." Lyle laughed once, sharp. "So I'm window dressing." "You are leverage," Wolfe said. "You believed you were steering the car. In fact, you were strapped to its hood. Your debts made you malleable, but not skillful. If your uncle awakens to this, he will freeze you out for sport." That was a direct hit. Lyle recoiled, as if the word debts had teeth. "Enough," Sen said. He stood, not abruptly, never that, but decisively, as if closing a file. "Dr. Pike, your consultant presents insult as inference. You have a board meeting. You will not carry this theater into it." "You will sit," Wolfe said, so calmly that Sen did. "Mr. Sen," Wolfe went on, "if you imagine politics protects you, you mistake the decade. Exposure eats institutions. I do not present insult. I deliver sequences. Here is the last link." He inclined his head at me. I crossed to the side table and lifted the slim recorder I'd found that morning under the arm of one of the client chairs, wedged so cleanly that I'd only spotted it because Fritz had vacuumed too well. I set it on Wolfe's desk and hit play. We heard room tone, a shuffle, and then Sen's voice from last night, smooth and close to the mic. "You mistake inevitability for guilt." Wolfe let it run 3 seconds more and stopped it with one finger. The device had other offerings. Vale's protests, Bell's indignation, Lyle's threat about lawyers, enough to prove someone had tried to capture the session without asking the House's permission. Wolfe doesn't permit electronics in his parlor without introduction. This had trespass written on it. "Whose is it?" I asked, though I knew he wouldn't have put it out if he didn't know. Wolfe tilted his head at Sen. "Yours," he said. "You carry a pocket model of that series. I saw its clipped profile in your inner jacket when you adjusted your cuffs. You intended a record. You planned to edit our words, to your edge before the board. You still might, but now Dr. Pike will carry the original, complete and unedited, along with Miss Yeo's statement." Pike's eyes went to me. I nodded. The recorder would be hers before noon. And if Lon Cohen from the Gazette happened to receive a copy later, well, accidents happen. Sen's poise thinned but did not break. "Do as you please," he said. "You mistake public appetite for moral appetite." "No," Wolfe said. "I merely count it." He shut his eyes, which in our house is equivalent to striking the gavel. I rose, opened the door, and they filed out again. Vale moved like a man trying not to be seen by the furniture. Bell paused at Yeo's shoulder and said something that made the nurse blink and nod. Lyle stalked through with a look that promised revenge against the nearest mirror. Sen, last again, gave Wolfe a look of careful contempt that would have been more impressive if he'd had purchase left for it. When the door closed, I turned back. "We're really done this time?" "We're done," Wolfe said. "I will not attend hospitals, and I will not attend boards. I have attended to the only thing in my care, the integrity of this house." He tapped the recorder with the back of a finger. "They trespassed. They will learn that my threshold is not merely wood." I slid the recorder into an envelope for Pike, then poured beer. Fritz, reading the room the way he reads a roast, brought the duck out early and set it to rest. The brownstone, relieved of visitors, inhaled, and the hush that followed had the feel of an orchestra between movements. "Afternoon," I said. "We'll hear something." "We will hear nothing," Wolfe said. "What must be said will be said elsewhere. We will dine." He closed his eyes again. I took the hint and let the phone sit where it was. If the board wanted a performance, they had one on tape. If they wanted instruction, they had it in paper. And if they wanted a lesson in thresholds, they'd just been given the house rules. The next day passed in fragments of reports, calls, and the kind of silence Wolfe cultivates when he knows the world beyond the brownstone is doing exactly what he intended. Dr. Pike phoned twice, the second time sounding more alive than she had since she first stepped into our office. The board meeting, she said, had been stormy but decisive. Sen had attempted to frame the forgery as a clerical accident compounded by hysteria. Vale sputtered compliance lingo to cover his own tracks. Bell tried to wash her hands of politics, and Lyle shouted about family prerogatives. Then Pike laid down the evidence Wolfe had packaged: Yeo's statement, the staple analysis, and the recorder. They couldn't walk away from it, she told me. They're opening an inquiry. Sen has been relieved of liaison duties pending review. Vale may be suspended. Bell's contract will be reconsidered. And Lyle, well, they told him to go back to the waiting room. Sounds like progress, I said. It's survival, she answered, and hung up before her voice broke. I carried the news to Wolfe, who received it with the barest incline of his head. He was at his desk, fingers steepled, as Fritz delivered a plate of braised duck and lentils. Your nurse, he said, demonstrated conscience. That will cost her. She'll survive it, I told him. Pike won't let her go under. You gave her a rope. She climbed it. Pfui. I gave her the fulcrum. She lifted herself. Wolfe speared a piece of duck and chewed slowly. Mr. Sen will not fall entirely. Men of his type never do. They cling like burrs. But his authority is diminished, his stratagem exposed. That suffices. I sat back in my chair and stretched my legs. And here I thought you'd mourn the loss of a perfectly good forgery. That one had flair. He grunted. Forgery is an art wasted on bureaucrats. They lack style. We ate in companionable quiet until Fritz reappeared with the cheese. Wolfe took a wedge, sniffed it appreciatively, and finally said, You observed, Archie, that hospitals are hives. Endless activity, ceaseless hum, yet directionless. This episode was a hive turned against its queen. A forgery to depose, a conspiracy to usurp. Inelegant but familiar. Men always seek to make institutions serve their appetite. That's philosophy, I said, not appetite. Both, he replied. Philosophy justifies appetite, and appetite, Archie, justifies everything. That was his sermon for the evening. Mine came later in the form of Lon Cohen, who called to ask why Pike had slipped him a copy of a recording from the brownstone. I told him if he wanted to print anything, he'd better spell Wolfe's name correctly, and hung up. The city would chew on Sen's fall and spit out a headline. Gotham General would patch its ICU with another layer of red tape. Pike would keep her post, bruised but upright. Bell would run her trials elsewhere. Vale would retreat into his manuals. Lyle would sulk. And Wolfe would continue to sit in his chair, orchestrating storms without leaving his rug. Around midnight, when the house was finally still, I paused outside the office door. Wolfe was there, lights low, eyes closed, breathing deep as if the silence itself were food. He'd saved Pike's career, restored Yeo's conscience, and reminded Sen that some rooms can't be entered without cost, and he'd done it all without rising from his chair. I went upstairs, reflecting that the brownstone had absorbed another battle without a scratch. Wolfe always says the house is his fortress, but nights like this, I thought maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was a courtroom, a stage, even a confessional, and I was the usher, making sure the players came and went on cue. As I turned out the light, Wolfe's final words drifted back down the hall, spoken to no one in particular. Appetite corrupts, but only intellect redeems. The balance, Archie, is rare. Cherish it when you find it. Which was Wolfe's way of ending the case. My way was shorter. I went to bed.